From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Oh, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, welcoming you to just another show right here on CAN TV. We are going to, a warning to our more sensitive listeners that we're going to talk about something today that's incredibly complicated and very difficult to understand and somewhat boring. So in order to do that, I thought we'd open with a parable today, okay? Just to kind of help us understand things a little bit. Let me set my clock here to make sure that I don't go over too long. There you go. My family is upset about the fact that our kitchen is really ratty. I mean, it's like years old and it needs a lot of work. So we bring some contractors in and they say, it's gonna cost you about $20,000. You know, you need new counters and cabinets and a refrigerator, wiring, all that. Well, we could swing it, but it would mean raiding the kids' college fund, and our 17-year-old daughter isn't happy about that. So we're really not sure what we're going to do. And then my sister, who is incredibly wealthy, she's a millionaire, she gives me a call and says, you know, I just sold the house in Highland Park, and I'm tearing it down actually because I want to get the money in so I can buy that and build that new place in Lake Forest. And I got a construction loan for 150 grand, and then I got another construction loan for 100,000. And then this one bank that I deal with all the time called me up and said, listen, we want in on this too. We're going to give you a $10,000 construction loan too. I don't need it, but I took the money anyway. And I figured I'll just give it to you because that's like half of what you would need to do your kitchen. And I said, wow, sis, that's just great. Thank you so much. She said, well, that's what sisters are for. That's what family is for. We help each other out. End of parable. Now let's extend it a little bit and say, instead of a little family, let's say we're a big tourist attraction in some big city somewhere, okay? It doesn't matter where. And we got the same problem. The people are complaining that your place is pretty ratty. It's kind of run down. It's kind of dingy. It hasn't been refreshed in 20, 25 years. You need to put something into it. I mean, the Ferris wheel is so damn small. Look at every other city has a bigger Ferris wheel. And then one day your sister calls and says, you know, the greatest thing happened. Somebody just dropped 55 million bucks in my lap. I don't really need it. I'll spend that money on something else, and then I'm going to just give you 55 million because I don't, and so that'll give you the chance to refresh that food court and maybe put brick pavers down and stuff. And you do, and it's all happy and everybody's happy. See what I'm saying? It's just people helping each other out. It's also a story about TIFs, and that's where Crains and BGA comes in. You know this story. This is, as they say in journalism, this is the story that blew the lid off this town. Money has been going to Navy Pier, but it may or may not be TIF money, and it's just really complicated. But today we got the guys here, both of them who've written that story. I'm just really happy to have you both here. John and Danny, thank you for being here. John Chase, of course, is with the BGA, and Danny Ecker is with Crain Chicago Business. How long did you guys work on this story?
That was a few months.
Yeah.
I mean, it was.
It has to be.
Yeah, I mean, it was a number of public record searches and, kind of shoring things up and finding some of these emails that laid this thing out as brazenly as you could imagine, which had us scratching our heads initially going, wait a minute, did we just not know about this? Everyone else knew about this. And so we started talking to people and finding out that, in fact, pretty much nobody knew about this except the small group of power players that concocted it.
We'll get obviously into all the detail, but I have to say that my first reaction when I was about 6 paragraphs into this is like, didn't Daley teach people that you shouldn't put stuff like this in emails? Don't they understand that eventually some reporter is going to read this? I mean, Daley used to say, and I worked for Daley, I know, Daley's office used to say, don't ever put anything in an email that you don't want to see on the front page of the Tribune. But they did. Yeah. Front page of Crain's in this case, yeah. Exactly. All right, so John, did TIF money buy that new Ferris wheel on Navy Pier?
Well, I don't think about the new Ferris wheel because that was a different project, but it is complicated as you said. But what happened is the city of Chicago gave MPA, which is often called McPier or Metropolitan Pier and Exposition Authority, which runs McCormick Place and owns the land the Navy Pier's on, $55 million in TIF money, ostensibly for a new hotel which is supposed to go next to this DePaul Arena. And I know you want to talk about that a little bit as well. That was a big controversy back several years ago when it was first announced. And then what they did was they turned around within weeks and wrote a check for the exact same amount to the penny. And this is sort of something people have, as the story came out, nobody's really focused on a little bit as much. But I mean, literally MPA was getting money from the city of Chicago here, and then 2 weeks later, writing a check for, at one point, $14,368,412.68. Literally, that's the exact same amount they got from the city of Chicago. They wrote a check for the exact same amount, and they handed it over to Navy Pier. So
For the purpose of
for the purpose,
renovating
and
Navy Pier.
that money, then Navy Pier was using that money for its renovation, which Danny knows a lot about because he's been covering Navy Pier as well too. But for this first phase of their renovation of their of Navy Pier, which has been run down, it hasn't really been worked on for decades, and so what we got though, what really sort of, so that money looks suspicious, like, oh my gosh, they're turning around and giving the exact same amount of money, and it's basically in your checking account and then out of your savings account. It's essentially, and but then you get to the motivation of what was really behind this, why they were doing this, and that's where the emails come in, and that's where we find emails from the CFO of MPEA, this group that runs McCormick Place, saying, we're just a middleman in this TIF arrangement. We don't keep any funding. We turn right around within days and give it to NPI. And so that's Navy Pier, sorry. And so that's where you really get the double beat on this story, which is not only were they turning around and basically taking this TIF money, and your viewers are smart enough to know TIF money is supposed to be used in one little geographic area to help urban blight, and then it's going to another place that's Navy Pier, which is the furthest thing away from urban blight as you can get.
I think the term of art is "but not for," isn't it, or something?
Yeah, but for. Right.
We will put money into areas that could develop, but for the fact that there's no investment in those neighborhoods.
Right. And in this case, this hotel, what was amazing too throughout this reporting process was that this whole project, the TIF use for the hotel at McCormick Place, got quite a bit of scrutiny. This was something that initially, when it was proposed back in May of 2013, they proposed it as $55 million in TIF money that was going to go toward this two-pronged project, which included an arena, a 10,000-seat arena, which was going to be the home of DePaul basketball, and this 1,200-room hotel.
An event center, I think.
Right, it was an event center, right, and they're very careful about that. And so there was a lot of blowback from the public on this. There was a lot written about it, and yet throughout all this discussion, they ended up having to sort of tweak this agreement to say, okay, none of this TIF money is actually going toward the event center, the arena. It's all going to go to the hotel. I mean, there was a lot written about it, and yet somehow it was not made clear, or no one understood or reported that there was this whole arrangement going on behind the scenes to say, well, they're actually using this TIF money to go to the hotel, which just frees up the money to go to Navy Pier. And if that were the case, I'm guessing there would probably be even more public blowback, and it might not have come through. And the key here was the need issue, the but-for clause, right? Because all these emails and everything kind of beg the question of, if TIF money is all based on need, and you can't do this but for the TIF money coming in, this development, well, it was clear from these emails and from all the records we found that MPEA had all the money it needed for the hotel. It was actually Navy Pier, this organization run by a separate private nonprofit that has no blight to it at all, that really did need the money.
And didn't have a way of raising the money.
Right.
I often refer to the turnip truck on this show, that you have these moments where you feel like, man, I feel like I just fell off the turnip truck. I just can't believe that I didn't. We've been talking about this incessantly, this project. I mean, we've talked about it 100 times on this show, starting with the event thing, and isn't it really just a a handout of money to DePaul, and then DePaul gets kind of shamed out of it and says, we don't want this money. Right. So then it just becomes an arena, and then they come up with this idea that, yeah, okay, we will clear the land and we'll use the money to to acquire the land for the hotel, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, a little mini speech here. That's a hinky deal in and of itself. But I could imagine being the alderman, for example, of this ward and saying, well, it's like, this is money that's going to come into my ward that's going to build this big economic development up on, like, I guess, the north end of the ward, and maybe some of my folks will be able to, maybe I can cut a deal that some of my folks will be able to work there. So it is economic development for my ward. I'm going to swallow hard, hope nobody watches, and I'm going to support this, which she did. Mm-hmm. And then we find out that even she didn't know that this money was actually being catapulted over to Navy Pier a couple of miles away.
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the there's several elements to the story, but the transparency element, the fact that the mayor's office never really talked about this.
Well, but they are the most transparent mayor. He's the most transparent mayor.
Oh, that's right, I keep forgetting.
So, exactly. I always have to remind people.
I forget it. I forget it every day.
Most transparent mayor.
And and so that's their answer on this was this initial announcement back in May of 2013, in which Rahm Emanuel, within a 30-minute both speech and question and answer from reporters, used the words event center, TIF, and Navy Pier at one point, and that therefore people through osmosis or whatever, we're supposed to glean that because he said TIF and Navy Pier during the same speech, people knew that the TIF money was going to eventually find its way to Navy Pier. But nobody did. The only people, as Danny said, the only people who knew about it are the people who were on these emails, the people at MPA, a few people at MPA who were, moving the levers on this machinery, and the people in City Hall who were on the TIF side of this, who were going to be handing over the money. The deputy mayor and the budget director. I mean, pretty much everybody but Rahm Emanuel himself was on these emails and was aware, in the upper echelon of the administration. And the alderman didn't know. We went and talked to the alderman initially and said, hey, did you know about this? What about this? You know that some of this money was on its way to Navy Pier? No idea.
Is it true that she found out when you talked to her? That's how she learned that this?
That's what it appeared to us. We approached her and asked her about it, and she had no idea that this was happening. So that sort of started, at least, I don't know who she asked after that, but we were the ones who brought it up, and she said she had no idea of the connection to Navy Pier. And the other thing with the transparency issue was, as we went through, we just sort of started at the beginning and say, well, how would this have gone through the process of getting a city approval to get this, this TIF money for the hotel in the first place? And you see, it does have to go through committees, and we kind of search the transcript, see how this was presented, and at every step, it was just either omitted or they just didn't describe this. They just sort of said, well, no, this is all, this TIF money is just going toward the hotel. Even these questions that were sort of asked that kind of were getting at this, they just sort of focused, no, it's just toward the hotel, and it was the kind of point of, if these aldermen didn't know which question to ask, they would never have found out about this. And
now this is where it really gets sticky, isn't it? Because David Riefman, who's now the planning commissioner, but was active in a lot of stuff all over the city long before he became planning commissioner, and Lori Healy, who's the CEO of MPEA, right. the McPier. They issued a statement. They wouldn't talk to you, I guess, but they issued a written statement, which is the term of art now for politics. That's the way it's done. Anyway, it appears that they did adhere to the letter of the law. They used the TIF. The TIF money comes in, and they use that money to buy the land. And then at the same time, because they already they had that money anyway, they take the money that's not TIF money and they give it to Navy Pier. So they didn't lie to you. They did take the TIF money and acquire land for the hotel. They did exactly what they said they were going to do.
Well,
is that not true?
It's sort of what it's sort of unclear at this point whether there's they say they focus on that point. And I think there are records that show that yes, this TIF money went to reimburse expenses related to construction of the hotel. But what these emails show, and that's, as we've said, this was not the purpose of the TIF money. Despite, and that was sort of this. If you want to call it staying within the legal boundaries, that's one thing. But this was not. This was a sort of a blatant abuse of this system. In order to say, well, this is just gonna be a front, and it's gonna obscure what we're actually doing here. So if you want to call that within, a good loophole that they found, that's one thing. But it certainly underscores this whole point about TIFs, and has long been scrutinized as this, this program that has very little oversight, and it can be used as a slush fund for the mayor.
And it's very, it's interesting that is their argument, and we knew within a month of getting on this reporting process, okay, here's how they're going to try to justify it. They actually didn't do it until after publication, but
you offered them the chance.
Oh,
many times.
many times.
Happily put their quote in the story. I'm
Sure,
sure.
absolutely,
Yeah.
of course we would have. We actually had an interview set with MPA. We were standing outside, basically waiting to come in, and then we got a call from them canceling it at the last minute. But that's up to them. But the point, it's overly clever. So give them credit for being clever. They are arguing that technically the TIF money was used on the hotel, on the land acquisition for construction, $55 million. We've got receipts here, and we handed that money, and it just so happened to free up the exact same amount of money. What that doesn't get at, if you give them that argument, which is still a little fuzzy in my mind because it's not 100% explained. But you give them that argument, they still don't answer the second question that you've already brought up, which is the but-for clause, which is you have to prove that you needed the money. MPA, if you look at it the way any developer wants to go and ask for TIF money. They want to build a project, and they say, and they're sitting on a bunch of money, and they want to go to an alderman and say, hey, I need $55 million, otherwise I'm not going to build this thing. And an alderman presumably should go, all right, well, let me make sure you really need this money. Let me look at your books. Let me see what's going on here. What exactly, how much money are you sitting on? And we have, from these emails, it is clear from the head of MPA, we have money for the hotel or Navy Pier, but not both. So they could have paid, right there and then, they could have paid for the hotel. They're acknowledging they had the money on hand to pay for the hotel. So what was the real motivation for that $55 million? It was clearly Navy Pier, because they got to do both. And because Rahm Emanuel said in 2013, well, this will allow, all this soup will allow us to be creative financially, they were able to do both.
That's another term of art, is the big bowl of soup, isn't it? The big bucket of soup, because it's a little difficult to figure out how many dollars and cents went here and there when you're pouring it all into the big tureen of soup.
And that's the oversight issue Danny's talking about.
Right.
Yeah, and the lack of it.
Now, okay, so that's where we're at. This money that was displaced found its way to Navy Pier, and Navy Pier, as we know, spent their $100 million, and we could do another whole show on whether they got $100 million worth of pizzazz out of that, but that's a different show.
Well, we don't even know, because we can't find out from their public records, because they're a private entity.
Yeah,
which is,
and that is yet another show, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in fact,
because you guys, aren't you guys suing them?
Yeah. So this is, there's obviously
different
the same
story,
characters, but yeah, the BGA, before I got there, sued when they, in 2014, sued Navy Pier and MPA back in 2011, right, Danny?
2013 or 2014 was when the lawsuit was filed.
Yeah, no, but they
2011 was when
2011 they created this public this nonprofit, the private nonprofit to operate Navy Pier. MPA still owns the
Owns it,
land,
right.
but they basically, outsourced to a private nonprofit to run the operations. So when they spend money, which they get public money, they clearly get public money. They're getting TIF money. They got another $60 million from MPA.
They didn't get TIF money.
Oh, right. I'm sorry.
They didn't get any TIF
Right.
money.
Okay. They got MPA money through the other checking account. And so they're spending this money, but if you go and ask for contracts or any of that stuff, you can't
It's
find
a
it.
private
It goes
entity.
behind the veil.
It's really
that's
remarkable.
another right.
That is, as I say, a completely different topic, but it's part of that. So I've gone so far deeply down your rabbit hole that I've actually watched all the videos and everything, and it is fascinating to watch Alderman Dowell at the groundbreaking for the hotel in 15, I think it was, in 2015.
Yep.
I mean, how enthusiastic she is about, this is a great thing for my ward and for the people who live in my ward. I enthusiastically endorse this whole idea. But what's really interesting is listening to the audio of Rahm Emanuel from 2013 when he announced what was then called Elevate Chicago. I haven't heard from Elevate lately. I don't know if they still exist or what, but I think it was just created for that one press conference, honestly, so that they could make some placards to put behind him or something. But Elevate Chicago was a plan to basically resuscitate McCormick, the McCormick Place campus, and to resuscitate Navy Pier. It was very clearly both of them. And it involved these elaborate plans to build 2 new hotels, to build this so-called event center. And the mayor said at that time that, and I think we all know because you were reporting on this, that Chicago was slipping, that it had slipped to number 4, maybe number 5 in convention business, and that it was clear that Chicago was going to have to step up its game. And part of that was going to have to be to make the place more physically attractive and more convenient. And so they were going to try to raise this money, and they did. And it's hard to put all of that in context now because when he speaks again later in 2014, or actually in 2015, he's jubilant. He's saying, look at this, we made this investment and we've gone from number 5 to number 1. We've had the best year we've ever had for convention business and for tourism. Tourism is through the roof. And it's kind of interesting at a time even when Chicago is having all of our problems that we're having with violence and everything else, we're still having more tourists come than we've ever had before. So the question that hangs in the air is, but for the improprieties, did we win by building all this stuff? Did it help Chicago? Did it help Chicago's economy?
I guess, still to be determined. This stuff hasn't opened yet. The hotel is about to open. The arena is about to open. They sold this thing in 2013 as this arena, this event center at the time, was going to be a money maker eventually. They could turn a profit with it. Making the case that the hotel was needed down there because they want to create this vibrant life. They even gave it a name, this vibrant entertainment district around McCormick Place that now they call McCormick Square. They want to give it a neighborhood feel, try to encourage investors with retail and restaurants to come down there. I think that's the vision for this thing, at least on the McCormick Place portion. The Navy Pier portion, the whole idea is to try to get more local people, down there to visit and spending money there because it had sort of gotten stale and had that carnival-like feel. Yeah. Is that going to draw more tourists, more outside visitors, spending money? That's not just people who are doing one thing and then they're going to spend their money elsewhere. So you have a substitution effect. It's hard to determine whether or not we won based on these investments, but it's clear based on that, and the whole convention bit about how successful we are in the convention business. The convention business, is almost every year has gone down in terms of the revenue that McCormick Place is making. Not all that has to do with McCormick Place and their own performance and how they run their business. There's a lot of convention centers opening up in middle-sized markets. That's actually now where they're trying to compete with an event center and all this other stuff. But what we can say, and what it should be tied to these projects, in perpetuity is that the way these were done was not above board, and this was, this was a total misleading way that it was done. So whether you want to say the end justifies the means, we don't even know, because we don't know if these are going to be worth the investment and whether they are going to be money-making efforts. But we can say that clearly this was done unscrupulously.
And one thing that sometimes gets lost in this, because that's a general argument that the mayor made yesterday. He got asked this question after the city council meeting, and
Lots of employment.
What's that? Lots of employment.
Yeah, jobs.
That
Keep
jobs
pointing to
creates jobs, and who's ever going to argue for jobs, against jobs? Nobody, of course. So but that's why he goes there. But what's interesting to me is that they take this money, and this money could have gone. This is $55 million. Not like chump change. This is a lot of money, and this could have gone for. I talked to a lot of different neighbors too, in that area. Burgeoning South Loop. They had near Bronzeville, which is another area that's struggling. And that money could have gone for scores of projects, parks, park district that's in need. There's a major school sort of scandal going on down there, involving expansion and hotel and high schools.
Talk about the whole thing about the South Loop High School. Right?
Exactly.
I mean,
South Loop High School.
They're having
a different TIF
right,
district, but exactly.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so those create jobs too. I mean, so the idea that the only place to create jobs is at McCormick Place or Navy Pier, while those are certainly big and they certainly generate a ton of revenue for the city of Chicago, and nobody wants to see them fail, the idea of taking from this pot that's supposed to be set aside for a certain geographic area, a certain region or neighborhood, I should say, and to fight urban blight. And to do this, whether they found a legal loophole or whether they actually, the money, that argument is almost, that's just one piece of the argument. Those could have created a ton of jobs and generated a lot more for the neighborhood that created that TIF money. That was created within just those boundaries, and it went 3 miles away. Sort of, through
just
whatever circuitous route you want to describe it.
Just so you know, our guests today are the authors of this incredible story in Crain's, I guess it's this week, but it doesn't matter. You can get it online. We all live online anyway, right? It's called Pier Pressure, and our guests are John Chase from the Better Government Association and Danny Ecker from Crain's. Let's see. Let's just put a couple facts on the table here. The TIF money can only be spent in the district in which it is generated, or the immediate neighbor, right?
A neighboring TIF district.
It can port into a neighboring district.
That's one.
Unless it's Navy Pier, in which case you can catapult. That's a whole new. You can just take this money, and it goes over there. No, that's not. They didn't do that. There's no TIF money at Navy Pier. I'm just joking, folks. Okay, so. The district in this case, this TIF district is what, the South Loop district?
Well, there's 3 TIF districts,
Okay,
all
this is
contiguous to each other. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a near South TIF district. There's a Michigan Cermak TIF district, and there's a Cermak
Calumet
Cermak TIF district that are all sort of adjoined.
They touch each other.
Yeah,
there's one side of the street is one TIF district, and the other side of the street.
Well, it's important that they touch each other because then they can port.
Then they can move
right.
around.
And they all encapsulate this area around McCormick Place, which has some blight to it for sure.
Yeah,
sure, rundown.
but it also raises a lot of tax money, right?
Sure.
I mean, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean the boom that's happened in the South Loop over the last 2 decades, decade and a half, 15 years. Is what created this $55 million in the first place.
Right.
That's, not every TIF district is loaded with $55 million because they're looking to spend that money.
See, this is one of the things that I think is so critical for people to understand. The TIF money that the city has is not a bucket of soup. It's many, many bowls of soup all over the place, right? And some of them, of course, obviously, I mean, what comes to mind is your story made me think of Mayor Daley's LaSalle Street TIF,
Street, right,
right?
TIF,
Which was just classic. I mean, if you could call LaSalle Street blighted, then you could call anything blighted. But that TIF, man, the money rolled in for years on that, and he was able to do a lot of interesting things with that money that he had almost exclusive control of. You know, the lighting on LaSalle Street is beautiful. And there's a lot of things that are beautiful.
The stuff's always pretty.
A lot of planters and things, which, you know, I have some mixed feelings about these things because LaSalle Street did not look good before TIF came in and cleaned it up. And if you're going to sell your city, it has to look good, and you have to have some of these amenities. And so I've always had really mixed feelings about TIF because in those cases, yeah, you know, it's done some pretty good things. And in fact, at McCormick Place, you know, there's that L stop, the green line L stop, which was done with TIF. However, the other side of this story is the side of, you know, the Englewood TIF, which has brought in like what, in 10 years, it's brought in not even $1 million, I think, or something, right? So the whole concept of TIF is a kind of a lie because it says we're gonna increment money from this community and put it back into the community. But if the community doesn't have any money in the first place, you're not going to get enough to do anything with it. But if it's got lots of money, then, you know, we're in the money, right? So, like I said, it puts me in a kind of a weird position because I can actually imagine being a mayor or an alderman and saying, I really need to make downtown look better. How can I do this? Oh, here's a creative way. I'll do this. And in doing that, I'll have to say, well, we'll put them all over the city. Right. But the ones all over the rest of the city aren't working as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I think for the LaSalle Street has often been used as one of the examples of like, oh my gosh, like how can you say that was blighted? The only thing that relates to our story is, at least as far as we know, it stayed within the boundaries of LaSalle Street. Yeah. And so, yes, LaSalle Street was not, you know, providing its fair share to the schools and the parks and the constant criticism that you hear about TIFs. But it generated the money within itself, and then it saw the benefits of it within that area. So, you know, you can make an argument, yeah, is that an abuse? Like, is LaSalle Street really a TIF? It was really a blighted neighborhood? Maybe not. But, you know, I guess you could also make the argument that, you know, hey, this was money that was generated by this area, and then we saw the benefits with streetscaping and all the other.
That's the thing about TIFs, is that they have done some very good things, but they have not lived up to their promise. And one of the things that I think someone could read your story and say, oh, look at this. They took money that should have gone to schools and put it into a Ferris wheel. But I would argue that isn't what happened, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of TIFs that would have generated toward the schools, but not so much. It's not so much that. It's other projects in the neighborhood is what you know. At that point, when these, and this is, you know, they create over years, they generate over years, they build up over years. And so that's the parts that don't find their way in little bits to the schools or to the library or the other taxing districts that stay within the TIF district. So, but by the point you're looking at a pot of $55 million, that's, you know, it's already sort of water under the bridge. And so at that point, you know, from my perspective, it's, should this be going for specific projects, again, in the neighborhood or maybe across the street? I think you can certainly make an argument that, you know, that's deserved. It's right across the street, you know. And that's where, you know, the people who got upset, the neighbors who I was talking with, did you know about this? You know, where they go, yeah, I mean, I can think of a dozen things. The school, you were talking about the high school you're talking about. There's all these projects that are needed for the people and that live there. They were the ones that had to, you know, to some extent sacrifice by having their money, you know, pooled in the separate other fund, and now it's, you know, not being used, you know, directly in their neighborhood for projects they want.
I thought of another argument that if I was still working in the mayor's press office, I would try to sell you.
Well, that would assume you would have talked to us before publication.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I don't know. It wouldn't have been my call, would it?
Yeah.
I would have made the argument that one of the benefits that Chicago got out of this swap is that Navy Pier got $55 million that's not a loan that it doesn't have to pay back, right? They got this gift from their big sister. And so in a way, the mayor just saved us a lot of money. He got us a rejuvenated Navy Pier, and the cost to generations later for not having to float bonds is a good thing. So he's kind of a hero for doing this. It's not TIF money; it's just some extra money that they had that they just sent over there.
Right, and that gets a little bit into Navy Pier Inc., this nonprofit that runs Navy Pier. So, when they formed in 2011, they got a $60 million gift from McPier, McCormick Place, the MPEA, that they said, okay, you're going to use this toward this framework plan that we haven't really figured out yet, but we're going to renovate the pier and you're going to use it toward this. The goal was that they were also going to get some bond money later from MPEA, which turned out to be this $55 million. But they're a nonprofit. The idea here, and this is part of why Navy Pier is only half done in many ways, they have all this other work to do, is they are trying to raise money. They always envision creating Navy Pier Inc. as this, similar to the group that runs the Lincoln Park Zoo. They said, well, we're going to get a bunch of donors and businesses that want to sponsor this, that come in, and that's what's going to fund a lot of our renovations.
Interesting.
So, they haven't been able to do that. It's tough as a nonprofit when you don't have a donor base to build on to get a lot of people to start donating to you. And so that was part of this, and that was partly why the $115 million, which is the 60 they got up front plus the 55, that was used on phase one. It didn't even cover everything they had planned for phase one, because they were hoping to raise more money and they hadn't yet. And
Which
so now
is
it's starting to trickle in.
Why it never really quite got finished. It's
right, and Navy Pier Inc., in fact, has actually had to go and find some other creative ways to finance things like the Ferris wheel.
Yeah.
They had to actually, they did take out bonds through the Illinois Finance Authority to fund the Ferris wheel, that they now have debt. This nonprofit's taken on debt to put this Ferris wheel in. The $55 million didn't even go toward the Ferris wheel. It went toward the South Walkway at Navy Pier, the new food court. Part of it went toward the new entrance park outside the front entrance. But they had a whole idea of getting this, the family pavilion, the entranceway that you walk into. That's pretty much untouched.
Yeah.
They've been able to do some things to it, but that was supposed to be done with this $150 million. And they had cost overruns and other things. So NPI, that was part of, and we could only get so much because NPI is not subject to public records laws. But, it appears, at least in some of the emails that we found, that NPI's lack of fundraising may have been some sort of contributor to this, because they had construction bills they had to pay. And the emails that we did see lay out, they say, NPI owes money, that $60 million is going to run out. We need to actually, they even changed the contract for the TIF just to accommodate NPI's cash flow issue. That's what was as stark of an example as anything.
They got some money from Polk Brothers, though, right?
They
the
did,
foundation
and that was in 2014. They got a $20 million gift from Polk Brothers that went toward this entrance park. That was the only big donor gift they've gotten.
Yeah.
They've had some small sponsors. Aon came on board with them to sponsor some things, and they've got a couple other sponsors that have helped develop certain areas of the pier. But the donors haven't rolled in as they've expected. That's for sure. We know that at this point from their tax records.
It's really interesting you make that analogy to the Lincoln Park Zoo, because the zoo over the years has just done amazing things with rebuilding itself. Completely rebuilding itself, and they have other capital projects going. But I think that it's just this fundamental difference. It's like, I anyway think of the Lincoln Park Zoo as being like it's a piece of Chicago's DNA. It's been around forever. It's a kind of a beloved institution. Whereas Navy Pier is not. Navy Pier is just someplace you go to watch fireworks or whatever, just a stroll along the lake. You don't have a relationship with it the way you might have with Lincoln Park Zoo or the Symphony or something like that. I think it's a kind of a tough sell to try to think that you're going to raise those kind of funds out there.
Yeah, well, and that's what they're finding. We're 6 years into the existence of Navy Pier Inc. as a nonprofit, and they've had some tough sledding on that front. And whether or not it has to do with either maybe they don't have the type of personal relationship with it someone might have with Lincoln Park Zoo, or the fact that in many people's eyes there's still such a connection between Navy Pier and McCormick Place, and people maybe some don't know that they're run by two, purportedly separate organizations. Maybe that's part of it, that people don't want to donate to government right now.
It feels like you're donating to McCormick Place, which I don't think I would write a check to McCormick Place to support McCormick Place.
And remember, the NPI board of nonprofit, they had a lot of powerful players, well connected with Mayor Daley and others who were on this board initially, and the idea was that they would help talk to their friends, and maybe they would donate a little bit too, and that hasn't happened. So, it's still it's an uphill battle for them.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. So, what do we take away from this? Is there a lesson that's been learned from this? Is there something you would like us all to make us better people?
Every day, we should be taking.
Well, certainly the BGA wants to make us better
we
people.
All,
I know that. Yeah.
It's hard to know exactly what lessons. It's still a little fresh. Clearly, there is not. As Danny said at the outset, this was a project, this DePaul project, started out with 2 hotels and the DePaul Arena, and then there's protests, and there were a lot of eyes on this, a lot of attention paid to it, and nobody saw that this was what this was happening with this $55 million. Nobody knew the full loop of the story as far as and the point is transparency, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at, is an oversight, especially related to these huge pots of TIF money that even people have been complaining about TIFs and critical of this one project, and we still don't know. I think we know a fraction of what the reality is as to how this money is spent and what its true purposes are, and why it's being used and what it's really being used for. And so so I think that's the one big takeaway. I think there's other smaller takeaways, about reform that aldermen and other city leaders can advocate for.
Yeah.
But the fact that the project is this big and was this well known, and people didn't know the whole story.
Out in front of everybody.
Out in front of everybody was not some
many press conferences.
Many.
Yeah.
And
So finally, what if all the agencies together had said, we would really like to apply for $55 million in TIF money to help us with acquisition of this land. And we're going to go out for big loans for the hotel and everything else. And one of the loans is going to include in it $55 million for Navy Pier, because that's our sister. We work with them and all that. Would that have been okay?
I'm not.
I don't know. You got to get. There's a lot of details in there,
Yeah,
right?
right.
I mean, are we talking about TIF money? I mean, that's what it all comes down to.
What I'm saying is if they had been upfront about this and said, we want to put $55 million into this, acquisition stuff, just like they did. But we also have this need over at Navy Pier. So when we apply, I don't know what loans they got. I mean, obviously it's easy to get a loan for a 1,000-room hotel. I'm sure it's not that hard to do, right? So we're going to go for this loan, but the loan is going to include $50-some million for Navy Pier, because we got to do some work over there too. That would have been okay, wouldn't it?
Well, essentially, that was kind of how this was said. This was happening. That this was MPEA money, bond money.
Yeah.
That MPEA was on the hook for, that they were transferring over to Navy Pier Inc. So that's how this was understood for the last few years since the project was announced. That the $55 million was going to come from MPEA, their bond money, and that because they own Navy Pier still, the land.
Right.
So yeah, that's that they could put their money to it, but they're on the hook for it. And TIF had nothing to do with that portion of the plan.
Yeah.
They were told about this. This was DePaul's money. DePaul coming in to make this event center.
Right.
That's what was freeing up MPEA's ability to fund Navy Pier.
That's a very important point, which we've overlooked here. Is that when the mayor made the decision to reassign the TIF money to the hotel, earlier on he had said the money was going to build the event center, which Ben Joravsky and others then just immediately branded as the DePaul Arena, which upset DePaul, I guess. And And so it got to be too hot for the fifth floor to handle. So they said, okay, we're not gonna use the money to build the event center. We'll use it to buy the land for the hotel, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that was exactly how they pivoted from that. You know, we discussed May 2013. He makes this announcement. By January 2014, they had pivoted and said, okay, forget the TIF money's not going for DePaul. Right. We're not giving public money to a private institution. It's all going to go toward the hotel, which is going to be publicly owned, all of it, for either land acquisition, construction. And then, meanwhile, this other part of the story was not being talked about.
And I just learned something else interesting yesterday too that I had not known, just in looking up other things, that the city acquired this land that the hotel's going to be on. So it's city-owned land. So the hotel will not pay property taxes. So we just spent, and this we did, we spent TIF money to buy land for a building that's going to house thousands of people and be a big, huge, probably very well-funded organization that's not going to pay any property taxes. So we spent TIF money to prevent ourselves from getting property tax money.
But it's creating jobs.
It's created jobs.
It's created 30.
Created a lot of jobs for lawyers, it looks like, too.
Yeah.
All right, well, no further questions, Your Honor.
Lesson to be learned, honestly, and just an alderman seeing things like this in the future. You know, when it comes to TIF proposals and saying, we've been duped by this before. We've seen this, you know, we've seen this been presented one way and something else happens. That should be a lasting lesson here, is that aldermen should say, all right, we need to see even more, because look how clearly we've been duped before, and this is that's hopefully what the legacy of this is.
Right, they have to get under the hood and really look at this
still
stuff and be allowed to.
45 or some aldermen voted for this thing. And
Thinking it was something else, of course.
Thinking it was something, but I liked Wagasback's comment in your piece when he said, I knew this was a boondoggle, I just didn't know it was a Navy Pier boondoggle.
Yeah, exactly.
And on that note, we've run way over time. We gotta get out of here. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your work. We always talk on the show about how much we love journalism, and I think it's kind of cool that we're talking on a day when the New York Times just announced that they've doubled their digital membership, and the failing New York Times now has more digital members or subscribers than ever before. So people are appreciating journalism, and that is a very good thing.
Yep, agree.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us.
John Chase is with the Better Government Association, and Danny Ecker is with Crain's, and we will see you again next week with another show right here on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Don't forget, you can watch this show anytime you want right here. Just go to this address. Also, go to SoundCloud, and you can listen to us on your earbuds on the L on the way home, when you're on the Green Line and riding by McCormick Place. It'll give you a different perspective. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Bye-bye.